Colin, thank you so much for joining me. Um,
Yeah.
so we're going to be talking about some subjects that, to be honest, I was a little bit afraid of talking about. And really, that is why we're going to be talking about them, because I realized that the fact that I'm afraid of talking about them is precisely why we should. And that is, a topic that you've sort of become a bit known for talking about, and that is, uh, well, I don't know how to best put it, but gender reassignment, gender identity in children, I suppose. Would that be an accurate characterization?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I criticize gender ideology as a whole, but my motivation for criticizing it, besides the fact that it's just kind of a crazy set of beliefs, like there's a lot of other crazy beliefs out there I could be criticizing, but this is important, I think, because of what you kind of just brought up. It has a lot of impacts on women's rights and young children, for instance, who get caught up in this ideology, and medical institutions sort of adopting these ideas. So it's a very consequential belief system that I happen to think is really bonkers. So that's why I decided to talk on it, and why I think it's so important.
Yeah, it's interesting because when I kind of think back on my own views on it, we probably actually have some disagreements, and actually, in some ways, I'm trying to make up my own mind on some aspects of it, including even, transition and younger people, because I'm not 100% convinced that it is always the wrong thing to do. And I kind of see the arguments for both sides of the equation. And I think it's a very complex topic. But sort of taking that aside, taking sort of my own views aside and the arguments aside, what I find particularly disturbing and what's going on right now is that you can't have that conversation, because I think it's sort of crucial to have that conversation when you are dealing with something as complex and as life changing as that. So, the fact that I have so much fear, as do so many people around these conversations, what do you think, where do you think that comes from? Because that isn't necessarily the case everywhere and around the world. And in fact, in many progressive countries, including ones that support even, have very progressive policies around these topics, they're actually much more open in terms of having these conversations and sort of debating these topics. So where do you think that comes from, that sort of shutting down of discourse?
I think a lot of it comes from the way that trans activism and gender ideology has sort of taken over, or captured a lot of gay rights organizations, and have adopted a lot of that same terminology, and have adopted their flags and have modified it to a great degree. There was a big civil rights issue in gay rights that I was 100% on the side of gay marriage and equal rights for gay people and that type of stuff. I think it was a really great cause, and most people in Western countries would largely agree that there's, even the Republicans are much more open to homosexuality now and gay marriage, what have you. And so what's really happened is they saved all that symbolism, the rainbow flags, the LGBT community. This is like the same sort of group of people, but what they're emphasizing now is no longer sort of like this equality, like let me love who I want to love. There's really like that TQ at the end of it, LGBTQ, and especially the Q part, the queer ideology that is what that stands for. That has really kind of become front and center in this movement, and that's where the ideology is. There's no ideology in being gay. That's just, I'm attracted to people of the same sex, and just believe me that my love for this person is the same as your love for the person you have as the opposite sex. it's easy for people to get around. There's no ideology you're buying into, but the Q part, which is informing a lot of the T part and now kind of consuming the LGB part, it is an ideology. It's an ideology that's sort of, well, part of it's rooted in trying to break down boundaries between things, queering categories in nature like biological sex, and these are social constructs. But then it also has like this concept of gender as something being separate from sex that determines whether you're really a boy or a girl, no matter what your sex is, or a man or a woman. This is a crazy ideology, but because they've taken on the rainbow flag, they're still using the same institutions, the ACLU, the Human Rights Campaign, It Gets Better campaign. They've all switched to doing the trans stuff and adopting these ideologies, and people just have in their minds, they see the rainbow flag and they refuse to criticize it. And anyone who criticizes it is immediately put in the box with the people who used to criticize it in the past, when they were actually the bad people, or on the on the wrong side of progress. So it's kind of a brilliant move. They've really they're using the flags and all that symbology as this like a shield for their truly radical ideology that's underneath this. So it's hard to criticize without being painted as these old school bigots who just hate people.
Do you think that the reason they were sort of successful, and the reason that these organizations sort of went along with it, is because they've achieved to a large extent their goals, and so these organizations now sort of outlive their usefulness? Maybe not fully, but instead of because gay acceptance, for the most part, it's not perfect, but it has reached a large acceptance. Whereas, instead of sort of figuring out how these organizations may be helpful, let's say in other countries around the world where that is not the case, they have repurposed themselves to align with these new causes. Is that sort of accurate to what you're saying?
I think that's almost exactly what the big problem is. They have a lot of this inertia behind them, like ACLU and the Human Rights Campaign. These become multi-billion, sometimes million to billion-dollar companies, organizations. Even though they're operating under this banner of nonprofit organizations, there's a lot of money still being made in these things. There's a lot of people who are employed by them. And so when you have, you grow to this huge size because you're combating something, or you're fighting for something that's a truly good cause, like gay marriage. This is how they got most of their funding, is under this, that cause, that good cause, in my opinion. And then once they achieved that, once that became law of the land in 2015, what are they going to do? They just turn all the lights off and say, we've achieved what we're doing. There's no reason, bigotry is now dead, or at least we're achieving things. At some point you get closer and closer to what your ideal picture of a society is, and there's just fewer and fewer, I guess, bigoted dragons to slay. There's each additional victory is necessarily going to be smaller and smaller, and so you don't get that cathartic payoff by achieving smaller and smaller incremental victories. There's a diminishing returns of your victories that you're going to continue to achieve. And so that makes these crazy ideas all the more enticing, that sort of end up eating their own children. You have the trans movement right now and the gender ideology. This reconceptualizes what even being gay means. It's not even considered being same-sex attracted. It's being attracted to the same gender identities. Now you can have a literal opposite sex couple and they could call themselves lesbians or gay men, or just two non-binary people, or what have you. So you can see the funding too is the ACLU and the messaging, that as soon as the gay marriage thing passed, all their messaging just went right into the trans stuff. So you have this built-in multi-billion-dollar apparatus set on just injecting this ideology into society, and now everyone is just rapidly scrambling to catch up with this, because we didn't even see this coming. We thought there was a big victory for human rights and things were only going to get better, but turned out not to be the case.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because I saw acceptance of trans people as a victory of human rights. I didn't, the way I sort of understood it was whether you call it gender dysmorphia or maybe it's just something that we don't quite understand that happens developmentally that we haven't, figured out yet. I sort of grasped it as okay, somebody feels for whatever reason like they're in the wrong body. We just don't know why maybe that is the case. And in some cases, but I think a very small amount of cases, if you address that, a person can feel whole, and as long as they don't have any other issues involved, if it's just that one thing. And it seems like in some cases that is true because some people have, whatever the procedures are, and they go on to have fulfilling lives, but, some people don't. And so there seem to be other things or other conditions going on that get misinterpreted. So it seems like other things are going on that may be mistaken for whatever you want to call it, whether it's gender dysmorphia or whatever people think is, they think they're identifying as trans. And because sort of the medical community and the activist community are rushing to embrace that and it's sort of affirm that, this kind of idea of affirmative care instead of, with almost any other condition, you go to a doctor, they don't just confirm your own diagnosis. You get asked questions. They give you kind of a hard time if you went online and you Googled your symptoms. They work with you. And as I think the best kind of way that a medical practitioner will work with you is, listen to you, take your symptoms seriously, take what you say seriously, but also use their, challenge what you're saying, use their medical expertise and knowledge, and, come to some kind of diagnosis through their expertise. But, everything just kind of gets confirmed. But that's kind of not what's happening specifically, I think, again, in North America, because I don't think that's necessarily going on in the same way in many other countries. And interestingly enough, I think even what I've just said might land me on this list of transphobic, which I would have never imagined, anything I think or feel about somebody who's trans is that. In fact, I've always felt incredibly supportive before that was, popular and accepting. And I think something that my view is, anything that an adult wants to do, it's their private choice. But yet, I've never understood what the word transphobic meant, as it turns out, or the definition has changed. And it seems like you've had that experience because you've made that drawing. If you want to talk a little bit about the drawing that you did, where you sort of changed that, I think Elon Musk tweeted.
Yeah. So I made a political cartoon that it's called My Political Journey, and it basically shows the way I've felt over the last around a decade. I think maybe 12 years, or I think, yeah, or maybe like 10 or 12 years are in the cartoon. And basically it starts out, it's got like three things going on to it. It has, one is like 2008, and it's got a political spectrum right to left, and it's got me on the left of center, and then to the left of me, directly to the left is what's a person called My Fellow Liberal, and then there's a conservative off to the right, and we're all sitting there just relatively happy doing our thing. Then it's like 2012, and then the My Fellow Liberal, it begins immediately to run to the left, sort of dragging, pulling out the left end of the spectrum with them. and in doing so, dragging the center of the political spectrum closer to me. And then my face in the middle there is showing like kind of a little like alarm, and the conservative is still sitting there, and I'm staying in the same place the whole time. And then it goes to 2020 or 2021 is when I made it, and then it shows the person on the left has gone so far to the left, they're now labeled a woke progressive. The center of the political spectrum has now moved past me, so now I'm center right, even though I've never moved. And then the conservative is still sitting there. The conservative is laughing because the progressive woke activist is now calling me a bigot for having just been in the same place the whole time, and perceiving me as being right wing now. That cartoon really only reflects my feelings on a kind of a handful of issues. One of them is I guess women's rights, for one, because what gender ideology is doing is erasing what it means to be a woman. There's entire documentaries about this now, where is woman just a feeling? It's just this social construct. It has nothing to do with being female. You can't really claim to be a very active supporter of women's rights if you can't define what it is, or if anyone can just self-declare themselves into that category. I don't see how that works. Are they a protected class based on something real, or are they not? Then there's free speech issues, where the left, I used to consider myself on the left, in many ways I still do, but I kind of identified on that side because they were sort of the free speech party, at least in my view at the time. But now you increasingly see a lot of people talk about on the left, talk about free speech with scare quotes, or they'll say so-called free speech, and they'll say this, instead of free speech being a sort of a way to speak truth to power, they now are reconceiving it as being a way that the powerful are keeping the oppressed down or something. So that's really bizarre. And then there's sort of these racial issues as well, that the left has sort of moved on, where I was of the Martin Luther King, that treat people by the content of their character instead of the color of their skin. But now we kind of see the left shifting more towards this group-based identity politics, and they've sort of abandoned the concept of the individual. So on those things, I haven't changed. That's still my core values. But when I kind of look back now and survey the political landscape, I really see those values are more on the center right now than they are on the left. So again, it has nothing to do with me moving. It's just sort of the left has moved relative to me. So I think gender ideology has a lot to do with some of that shift. That was maybe the tipping point for me. But there's been a lot of shifting grounds over the last decade, for sure, that I think a lot of people are feeling this kind of reorganization of what does left and right even mean right now.
Well, and a lot of changing definitions, and sort of I think a lot of inconsistency of beliefs as well. So when people say, well, I believe in free speech, and then they're like, well, but I don't believe in this, or and this person shouldn't speak, right? And on the sort of on the right side, I've noticed where it's like, well, we want freedom, but then we don't want freedom for this, and this. So it's like there's just a general inconsistency in both, I think, spectrums, where they claim to be for something, but when it comes push comes to shove, when it goes against some particular ideology of theirs, they're not consistent at all, I think, in their values and their principles, and what they say, what they really believe. So the more I kind of look at it, the more I find these inconsistencies, and it's really frustrating. And then you get labeled, if you're like, well, I believe in free speech, well, they then suddenly you're a right winger. Since when? And if it's my body, my choice, right? One of the inconsistencies. Well, if you were consistent with that, well, then you supposedly, then you wouldn't believe in something like mandates. And especially if you're somebody who believes in you're pro-choice, and certainly we would believe in choosing, what to put in your body. So it's like there's just this tremendous inconsistency in beliefs that I'm seeing, again, on both spectrums, and a changing kind of definitions of words. Then, more than anything, and I think very dangerously so, and especially, when we're talking with the topic or we're discussing, is like, it becomes impossible to have conversations where, what seems to happen is that all you hear are like the activists and the extreme voices, because everyone else is kind of afraid to speak. And so decisions get dictated, and policies now are dictated by those with the loudest voices who are not afraid to speak because they're radical. Radicals are not afraid.
Mhm.
But why? And that is more than ever, Do you see kind of way out of that at all?
Yeah, that's tough. I guess that's kind of what I've been trying to do for the last 4 or 5 years. I've been talking about this, been trying to sort of break that silence, because in the very beginning there were just, you could count on one hand the number of people who are on Twitter who were talking about gender ideology and who were saying that, that people really are denying biological sex out there, and people would insist that that's not even happening. And so my goal was just to sort of get this information out there. And it was a big risk. I basically lit my entire academic career on fire because I just didn't want to have to lie anymore, and I didn't want to write these DEI statements that I thought were pretty crazy as well. We're in a much different place now, though. I think we've been winning a lot. I don't want to take full credit for any of it, because a lot of really great people, even before I started talking about it, were doing this. But there is just a lot more people speaking about it, and because there's more people, it's less costly for the next person to speak out. When there's only a handful of people and someone speaks up, it's easy for the mob to just all target that one individual. But when 100 people stand up at once, it kind of spreads out the targets. There's too many targets for them to hit. They can't quite get them. I think we're at that point now where, there's still people who don't want to talk about this stuff, and it can still be really damaging to your career, depending on, sort of the political makeup of it. But it is a lot easier. People are understanding more. They're sort of realizing how completely bonkers things are getting in the realm of sex denialism, and how this is affecting the world around them. That really all that there is now is getting it out of the institutions. I mean, we've changed a lot of minds, but there's been a lot of work done behind the scenes, sort of entrenching this in ways institutions, and we need to just really try to root it out of there as much as possible. So I'm still trying to change people's minds in many ways, because it is going to just take a certain critical mass of people before things start to change. But I think we're getting there. I think the more people now are awake to this idea that what's going on than there ever have been. We just need to actually start moving the real needle and getting policy changes happening to affect that.
Yeah, and I mean, if you don't name it, you can't deal with it. The idea that, because you don't want, you see an issue with, say, trans people being put into women's prisons, or athletes competing, that means you're hateful towards somebody who's trans. It's ludicrous. But it is an issue, and therefore you need to figure out how to solve it. And if you're not being accused of being hateful, then you can come together easier with the community, or with people, and figure out a solution that may work best for everyone. And if you can't do that, then you can't come up with a better solution that includes those people, right? So it must have been when you sort of decided to speak out about, gender issues and things like that, women's rights. Was that a gradual process for you to speak out, completely and fully, or were you, from the beginning, did you speak completely honestly and bluntly about these things?
It was a kind of a slow burn, and then it happened all at once I started talking about it. So um I had noticed a lot of the way the conversations were being kind of restricted on these issues of trans issues, especially. There was never any issue of talking about women's rights issues unless it was involved in saying that, well, that trans women aren't literal women in every single way. That's when you get in trouble for that. And so I got into some, debates among some Facebook friends, other colleagues and things like that. And the first things I was seeing really was people posting articles, and these are people who are in PhD programs, saying things like there's 5 sexes, or that there's a sex as a spectrum or a social construct. And my initial reaction was that this is just really silly, and I understood what biological sex actually was, what makes a male and a female, what those terms actually mean, and the idea that there's 5 of them, or that there's an infinite number of them with a spectrum, or that's not real at all. Like those are all incompatible beliefs in themselves. It was merely just like, I'm going to correct the biological record here and just be like, no, actually, here's some papers about the evolution of sex. Here's what it means when we're talking about males and females. It was really just like a scientific, like, oh, this is someone just posted something that was incorrect, and I'm gonna correct them, and we'll have just like a friendly discussion. And I was really expecting it just to be like, oh, thanks for the link. I wasn't aware of that. Thank you for the update. That was like absolutely not what I got in return.
No, I expect not.
Instead of getting back people that were saying, oh, interesting points, here's why I disagree, which I'd have been totally fine with. It was just unanimously just like, this is transphobia, this is bigotry. Of course, this would come from a white man saying this stuff. And I was just like, where is this coming from? This is completely insane. Some people I really, really respected would just post like 1,000-word paragraph in these responses to me that was just like complete lunacy. I was like, what is happening? There's something going on here. It actually really frightened me at first, because these are public posts on Facebook among colleagues that I knew, and I was in graduate school, and like I didn't want to rock the boat. I'm trying to get my PhD. I was trying to get a postdoc after that and get a tenure track job. Like, this is what I'm in. I studied social behavior in insects and arachnids. It's a small community. I really can't poison this well for myself at all. So I really just sort of deleted all my comments, and on the suggestion from some of my mentors. It got to the point where I realized I was going back through everything I'd ever liked on Facebook, and I was unliking, the Sam Harris podcast, and unliking the Richard Dawkins Fund, just things that, at the time people would consider, I don't know, maybe offensive among really progressive people, which is weird. And it just really all of a sudden hit me that this is what I was doing was insane. Like I wanted to be a scientist, not so I could just shut up and do what's told and have people tell me what's true and I'm not allowed to criticize it. Like, my reason I wanted to be a scientist in the first place was the exact opposite, because I thought being an academic biologist would be the place where we could talk about ideas about biology, and people would attack the argument and use evidence and reason, and wouldn't, just call you a bigot for saying something. Well, that turned out not to be the case. So once I realized that my idea of what academia was, that was based on what it was maybe, over a decade beforehand, like my vision of what it was, that was no longer the case. And because that was no longer the case, I really had to reflect about, well, is this something I still want to do? And for a while it was like, yes, I'm just going to double down. But then this whole stuff just kind of broke out free. There was like the evergreen college stuff where all this stuff was coming to the surface, all the crazy gender ideology, trans stuff. Then there was like James Lindsay writing his stuff with Helen Pluckrose and Peter Boghossian, showing the frivolous scholarship in these gender studies fields. There were articles that were published in Nature talking about the sex spectrum, and I was like, this is just gone out of control. Like, Nature is writing articles about the sex spectrum now. I can't ignore this. I wrote an article for Quillette that was really just about the biology and why it's silly to deny the biology. It didn't even go into like sports, trans males and female sports. I didn't talk about males and female prisons. It didn't go into any of that stuff. Nothing even about gender ideology whatsoever. It was just like, they're wrong about biology. And then it was only me trying to like looking under the hood, like, well, where are these ideas coming from? What are the consequences of these things? That's where it's just like, oh, this is the queer theory, this is the gender ideology, and this denial of a really fundamental aspect of human biology and biology generally. But for humans, we're sexually reproducing species, we're sexually dimorphic, we have differently evolved behavioral tendencies between the sexes. Like, to deny that any of that is real, it's just it's going to create these crazy circumstances, which we're seeing right now. We're seeing males and female sports and in prisons, and we're lopping off children's healthy reproductive anatomy because they are saying that they identify as the opposite sex, and they're just affirmed and unquestioned about this stuff. So it's completely crazy. So so I was silent for a long time, couldn't take it anymore, wrote an article, and ever since then I've just been kind of really pretty narrowly focused on these few range of topics here. So yeah, that's how it's been.
Well, you mentioned that people were, responded in these really passionate ways, really emotional ways, it sounds like. What do you think causes people to react in these like deeply kind of intense ways to this particular topic?
Yeah, that's a good question. It might not be one I'm really fully comprehend. I do think it is that, like, there is an issue with academia generally being very skewed politically, and so whenever any topic sort of has it touches on anything political, their objections are going to be informed by that to a large part. So when I was starting to criticize these things, I mean, one of the biggest criticisms that I received, wasn't even a criticism or an argument at all, but like that I'm just like, I'm making these far right or alt-right talking points, and that, even if I'm right, they wouldn't even say that, but like the implication was that, even if I'm not right wing, like I'm going to fuel the real crazies that are out there, and they're going to do something crazy because they really do hate trans people. And so if I say these sets of things as sort of this middle person, I'm just emboldening those people. And it's just like, well, I don't know what to do with that. Like, because should I just not say true things because some crazy person on the other side will do something, and just cede the ground to the crazies on the opposite side?
Well, I wrote about this. It's this idea that we can have this monopoly on the narrative because, if you control it, then you can control it to the advantage of a better outcome, right? The noble law, the idea of this like noble lie, which is, very sort of narcissistic and very grandiose to kind of think that you know what the greater best outcome is by holding on to the truth, and two, that you can control that. So yeah.
I'll just add briefly, it was really something I had become really aware of, like that dynamic, in following Sam Harris's career, because he would criticize Islam, a set of ideas, and then he's been billed as like this Islamophobe, and he's going to fuel Islamophobic right to do things, even though like what Sam is saying about the Quran and what they believe is totally true. And so I remember that dynamic working for him and against him. And so it was really easy for me to see that that's what they were doing when they were doing it to me. I wasn't like caught off guard. It was like, this is clearly the same thing. And it's really just political, the political valence on in academia, I think that's the main problem, because no one wants to be, because if you're not with them, you're against them, you're a Trumper, you're all that stuff.
Well, you don't trust. It's like you there's this like elitist thing here, because you don't trust the population to know better. It's the same thing. It kind of reminds me of like the New York Times and other publications. Often when something happens and the act is carried out by somebody like a Muslim who is a radical Muslim person, like with the recent act with, I really hope I don't mispronounce his name, but Salman Rushdie, Is it Salman Rushdie or Salman Rushdie?
I say Rushdie, but I
Yeah,
think
you're
it's,
probably right.
I'm not 100% sure.
I feel embarrassed, but great writer, whose
Yeah.
name I don't pronounce properly. But you know, he was shot by someone, and it is clearly there is a reason for it. And the thing is, I'm fine with them staying neutral in their reporting without, if they don't have confirmed facts, but they don't do that consistently. But they did it in this case, and they did it in the past with a synagogue hostage situation. They say, you know, British men. Well, it was, and you know, it doesn't look like it's motivated by anti-Semitism. Well, it was. And in this case, you know, it was very clear. And the reason that they will, you know, this kind of the noble idea here is that, you know, you don't want to encourage Muslim hate. Well, I don't want to encourage Muslim hate, but the idea that because, you know, these two people committed these hateful acts, happen to be Muslim, and then that somehow ties it into now all Muslims are, you know, bad and terrorists. You know, you're not trusting your audience, you know, to know the difference between these particular two Muslims who are radicals and are hateful, and then, you know, the vast population of Muslims who are not that. Especially ones who live in the US. And of course, there are people who are going to take that, but they're just hateful, you know, and interpret it in their own way. But they're just hateful people who are, you know, racist and bigots or whatever in the traditional sense, right? Yeah, and again, it's like this monopoly on truth that, you know, only they can have. But I
Yeah.
think that the only way forward is ultimately is the truth, and let the cards fall, because everything else is then subject to human fallibility, right?
I see this tendency they have where they're striving to, like, you know, censor certain things, like don't let them know this is a Muslim, or don't let it, you know, don't talk about these trans things because it'll enable the real transphobes. It always backfires. It always turns into like, well, we know what you're doing. So now whenever you say British man and you don't specifically say that it was a white person, like we all know. And then it creates these, you know, well, I would call them conspiracy theories, but in this case, like they're actually doing it. And so it ends up just creating more of this resentment because they know they're being lied to. They know that people are trying to manipulate the message. It's like
100%.
that Streisand effect. You know, I always look at people like Milo Yiannopoulos. Like he actually did end up getting canceled for his comments on, you know, sexual relations with boys and things like that. But, you know, before that, people hated him. They went to these big protests, and that just made him more popular than ever. You know, he was at Berkeley. I think they caused like $600,000 worth of damage at Berkeley because the protests got so insane to try to make Milo not show up. And all they did was make him this like poster boy for the right and stuff like that. And so it never works. It's always the opposite always happens. So if they were actually concerned about the real world impact of their actions, like they would just, well, ignore people like Milo rather than giving him a bigger platform. And they would just try to speak the truth on nuanced issues, because then everything's out there in the open. And, you know, yeah, there's some bigots that are going to do crazy things, but criticize them when they do those crazy things. And
Exactly. And it's the same thing too, like when we're talking about like where do you argue from, you know, where people sort of get emotional versus logic. I think a lot of people have said to me that I tend to kind of argue from a place of logic. And the truth is I think I'm a fairly emotional person. But I guess if I think about it, like I probably do argue from a place of logic. And I think it's because a place of logic is probably the closest you can get to truth. You may never get to 100% truth, but you can strive towards that. But a place of emotion is always going to be, you know, highly loaded and subjective, and it's also emotion is you're arguing from a place where you are, you know, essentially triggered. You're heated, you're reactive, you're in a state of fear, flight, you know, heightened emotion. It's not and it's as far away from logic as you can get. So, and
they're both super important though. Like you need to have an emotional reaction to things. Like if people weren't had emotional reaction to slavery occurring, if it was just like that wouldn't have motivated anyone to end it. But you still need to prioritize what's true, because you can't really achieve justice in any meaningful sense if you're not actually committed to the truth of the situation. You can't remedy an injustice unless you're can accurately describe what that injustice is, who it's being applied to, what are the facts of the situation. So like they really go hand in hand. Like the emotions could like motivate us to go in directions, but if we have a bad idea of what the state of the world actually is and what the facts are, like you're probably just more likely to make things worse when you try to start muddling with things than you are to actually achieve any real justice. You're probably just going to create more injustice elsewhere. And that's kind of what's happening with the trans stuff. They don't want to distinguish between males and females who identify as women. And so by not doing that, well, then you have other injustices that pop up, like males and female sports and in prisons, and injustices that are happening to children based on weird ideologies. But if we just sort of backed up and really looked at the facts that males and females are real biological categories. You can't change your sex. People have dysphoria. They need certain accommodations. That doesn't mean we jettison the whole idea of male and female. There's a reasonable tightrope to walk, and some areas can get sort of, fuzzy sometimes morally and even what the facts are sometimes. But that doesn't mean you just throw facts out the windows. Like, yeah, some things require some more careful attention to detail, and there can still be disagreements. This doesn't mean that we can just construct our reality as we're going through it, and that's not a way to achieve justice on anything. It's just
no
randomness.
Well, where I'm emotional with this topic is what I think largely dictates a lot of things for me is kind of a sense of empathy. And that's why I was always kind of able to understand what it might be like to be in somebody's shoes if they're gay. They want to get married and they're gay. If somebody's trans and wants to live their life as a trans person, it's just a sense of empathy. And I can also understand somebody who might be younger who wants to transition. And then also facts come into that too, which kind of makes me, weigh a lot of factors, which makes it such a complex and difficult subject for me, where I'm really not sure of what the right answer is. So, if I was kind of arguing pro transition, I would say, well, there are some examples of people who have transitioned when they were very young, who go on to have really great lives, and they really can suffer quite a bit when if they're forced to live in a way where they feel like they're in the wrong body. And an early transition means they don't have to go through puberty. Their transition quality is better. And there's some examples of that have been really strong with right support, et cetera, et cetera. However, that number is small, and we can't be 100% sure that this will work. So that's the counter argument that makes it really difficult, because we also see a lot of people where that was not the right decision for them, and they detransition and the changes are permanent. And, people then can't have kids, their voices change, they do permanent damage to their bodies. And in particular, in this current environment, where there is this kind of very, very affirmative care that does not really take seriously the concerns around this, it seems kind of a very bad idea. And so it makes it it's like, do you allow this for the few where it really would genuinely benefit them in a real way? And how do you weigh that against the harm that it may cause possibly a greater number of people? And that's what makes it so difficult. And that's a really difficult moral question, I think.
Yeah, I agree. There is nuance there for sure. They had a previous method that they used when they were deciding, what kids receive puberty blockers, for instance. It was called like the Dutch protocol, and it was, you'd have to have gender dysphoria start from a very young age, almost, from the days you can even send sort of signals that you have sort of this really very body-centered, often very genital-focused, like hate for your body, that is consistent, insistent, and persistent up until the point, you start puberty and it's still insistent, doesn't go away. And then so their method, when all those criteria were met and no other psychological issues and stuff, those are the people they usually gave puberty blockers to, because the data showed that the vast majority of them won't desist. If you've had it from a young age and you can continue to persist in your dysphoria when after your puberty starts, you're most likely going to continue into adulthood. But the cohort we have right now are these so-called like rapid onset gender dysphoria kids, where they never had a history of gender dysphoria whatsoever, not even like any sort of cross-sex behaviors or anything resembling it. Suddenly they're during puberty, in the middle of puberty, sometimes even near the end of it, they all of a sudden claim that they're transgender. They want surgeries, they want puberty blockers, things like that. There's just no data on this, on these people, this cohort of individuals. And the possibility that they're caught up in some sort of social contagion is very high. And the possibility that there are just a ton of false positives is also very high. Now, we've never even heard of detransitioners until recently, once they've been adopting these policies. And then mix that with things like affirmative care or affirmation therapy, which, even though the DSM-5, the Diagnostic Manual to Diagnose These Sort of Issues, even though they have these criteria that you need to meet for dysphoria, well, affirmation therapy just sidesteps all of that, because you have to just take the kids at their word for what they are. They know themselves better than anyone. So there's really just there's no rails on
right. And the thing is, we do know that these diagnoses are wrong and too quick, because we do know that there are so many detransitioners. I personally even were like in my circle, there are definitely people who've been through this, and it is irreversible in some cases. Some people are more lucky than others in terms of their the effects that it's had on their bodies, depending on the length of time. I don't know, like, a lot of people say this, but they're like, I don't know what it'd be like if I was a teenage girl growing up, like, especially if I was a tomboy, which I was,
so common.
It's so common, right?
Yeah.
And especially when you're dealing with things and you want to be part of the community, and you suddenly find this place of belonging, is like, oh, maybe that is the answer. And then the things that the hormones do to you, like they have huge effects. I mean, birth control has huge effects on some people, like massive effects. So just think of what taking the other one would be. So it's like, it's really tough. It's like, you want people to have freedoms. And I'm somebody who's very like pro freedom and choice, but at the same time, you especially since we also don't give all that much freedom to young people. So to say like you can't get a tattoo, you can't drink, but you can do this, seems, then you either give kids all the freedoms, or you moderate the freedoms, right? Like, again, what we were talking about, consistency, this comes up a lot for me lately. It's like, you do have to be a bit consistent with you either believe that kids can make all these important choices about their lives, or you believe that maybe at some point it is too early to make these choices. And even adults don't always make, the best choices, but at least we've decided that, hey, adults should be able to make them. And and there is some scientific basis there, because, we've, the developmentally, there is a certain point at which scientists have sort of decided that have determined, I guess not decided, but determined, that's an important distinction, that the brain has sort of stopped growing, as sort of, or isn't growing as much. And so these decisions, an adult brain is able to make decisions for themselves. I mean, even as an adult, the other part of this, I guess, is I wasn't quite as aware as I am recently become, but the pharmaceutical industry, right? Like, once a giant industry pops around something, it is there. Like, and I've seen this with all the COVID stuff, just the industry around masks, for example. I'm like, okay, once all these companies come along, like, man, that's hard to take apart. Pharmaceuticals, with all these, just the millions of dollars, billions probably of dollars that are going to be spent for that, and this huge industry that was set up, and then all the plastic surgery procedures as well, the bottom surgeries, which I did look at. I did not know how. I can understand now why people don't have them a lot of the time. They're not, the success rate is so not great, and even the successful surgeries, it's not a great surgery. Like, I had no idea like what it actually leaves the person with. It's just, and it's not really talked about. Like, you have to kind of dig to find out.
And when it is talked about, I mean, we saw the videos, for instance, from like the Boston Children's Hospital stuff that's been going on. They talk about when we're going to create the penis. It's like, you're telling this to these kids. A lot of them have been sort of diluted by the gender ideology stuff, and some from a very young age, where they think that, a little girl thinks that she's really going to get an actual penis and a boy will have an actual vagina. But like, these are not the equivalent.
Yeah, I thought they were, to be honest. I thought they were. And then when I looked into it, I was like, oh no. And it's actually probably worse. I mean, I don't know. It's up to the person and how dysmorphic, I guess, they feel. Like, maybe it is better for them, but it's like, what it is not that at all. And it's so problematic, and it's the maintenance of that is also, and the danger of it, the physical danger that they will have for the rest of their lives is just, and it's being promoted in certain ways that are just, and I think it's a lot of it is about money and not about the well-being of the patient. So this is where my emotion comes in and my sort of empathy comes in. And then weirdly, I wonder, and part of me wonders if I'll be just called a transphobe for all of that, even though none of that comes from any place of like hate, fear, anything negative towards any of these people, like whatsoever. In fact, I think for both of us, I think it comes from a place of like concern and for the well-being, like, of these of people, as opposed to anything else negative. And it's weird that people are sort of attacking people for even speaking on these topics.
I'm concerned about the lack of proper safeguarding for children's health, and whether they can truly have informed consent on something like having their penises removed and being literally castrated and sterilized, never being able to have children. Or when you have a vaginoplasty, you never can achieve sexual pleasure, like orgasm. Like it's almost 0% of children having these procedures will ever be able to orgasm in their life when they're adults.
Yeah.
In my 30s, like I've always been very much of the opinion I never wanted kids, and it's really only been in the last 2 years that it's just been a complete 180. I absolutely want children now. And the idea that we could that a child in their, they'll give these surgeries to kids as young as 17 or even younger sometimes. I mean, Jazz Jennings, who had a vaginoplasty at 17, she was scheduled to have it at 16, but she had to lose weight before they could have the surgery. So 16 years old, sometimes you can have your penis removed and you're be completely sterilized. We can't expect, you can't informed, a 16-year-old cannot meaningfully consent to something that is that life altering, because there's just no possible way they can understand like what they might think as an adult. It just boggles my mind that we think these kids are these little philosopher kings who are just have such an insane amount of wisdom and self-knowledge that they can know this stuff. Like, I've been a kid. I was a moron. I was a complete
You were a
idiot
kid?
up until I was about my early mid 20s, maybe, when I became like a thinking person. So
I thought I was a very brilliant kid, actually.
I didn't. I thought I was like pretty average, and looking back, like, I wasn't very impressive at all. So
No, I mean, we part of our specialness as a human being is like that we can change our mind. I mean, we thank God some of the thoughts we have are terrible thoughts. It's a good thing that we are able to change our minds. And
yeah.
I hope that even on this topic, listen, I might come back and think completely the opposite of what we just talk about. Who knows? Like, I'm always like, present me with better evidence, present me with better thoughts, and I will absolutely be willing to change my mind in either direction. But like, as children, absolutely, we me and Bridget talked about having kids too. We both have changed our minds on that too. And I also categorically thought no kids. So I think all three of us.
I went to a consultation for a vasectomy, and they required me to have one more follow-up, and I was gonna do it, but I kind of got busy. I just didn't go for like a second checkup thing about it. But like I went in to get the form. I was very serious about doing that. So
Yeah,
I'm really glad I didn't do it.
that's right. You want to
Much
leave
less,
yourself.
and that's just a little snip, much less having my entire genitals removed.
You definitely want to leave yourself options, and you certainly don't want to limit yourself when you're a child, and certainly not when you're a a 7-year-old. And you want to make, and the thing is, it like, this is what drives me kind of crazy with this, is that it is so affirmative, and you don't like, I'm somebody who supports euthanasia. Like, this is like who I am, but not like for any reason, right? Not just for
over-the-counter cyanide pills or something.
yeah, not quite like, but I mean, if you're gonna off yourself, you're gonna do it. It's better if you do it. Like, what I like is that there's a process where you go, it takes a year, right? Like, you go through, there's mental health counseling, and some people change their mind in the process of it, right? But what I love is it's like, it's not an overnight thing. You go through the whole process, and the process really makes sure, and it's not just affirmative, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's the key. The key is that it's you can have the conversations, you can have the challenge, the back and forth, you can have free discussion, you don't get called a transphobe, you don't risk losing your license if you're a doctor who says, listen, this may not be the right thing for you, maybe you should try some other things, maybe you should go to counseling. That's what we should be focusing on, in my opinion, my very humble but not so humble opinion. And what's scaring me is that we don't have that. And I would like to figure out how we get from where we are right now to what we see in other countries, including very progressive countries, as I mentioned before, where they do support some of this, including some of this sort of ideology, but they do it in a way where, you have that freedom to choose, but you also have the freedom to question, to challenge, to go through the process, and to make sure that's really, truly the right thing. So
Yeah.
I guess my last question is to you is like, how do you go from where we are now to a better sort of to something closer to that?
I just do it by trying to, you know, base my arguments and, primarily in truth, but also try to inject as much compassion as I can. It's not fake compassion, or empathy either. It's very real. I mean, I do have a tremendous amount of compassion for people who are dealing with gender dysphoria. I'm so glad I don't have it. I hear it's completely miserable. I'm good friends with Buck Angel. He's described it to me, and it sounds like one of the worst things you could possibly go through. I can't even fathom how bad that must be. And I think people should be able to transition if they want to. Like, I'm really glad like this worked for Buck. Buck
Mhm.
transitioned later in life before they were a child. And it worked out for Buck. Buck's very happy. He's one of the most like comfortable people in his body that I actually know. And he just lives his life, and he doesn't want to live his life as a trans person. He just wants to live his life as Buck Angel and pursue stuff that any other person would like to do. He doesn't have a trans identity. He's just trying to live the life that makes him feel better. And so I have no problem with the Buck Angels of the world or the Blair Whites of the world, who I think transitioning was a very good thing for them to do. I'm really glad that they're happy. It really only comes down to like age of consent here. When can you actually choose to do that? And should we be giving these types of irreversible things to children? So to me, that's like the nuanced position we should take. Have compassion for kids who are dealing with this, but still also realize that they're children, and they're not informed about what everything they could possibly be informed about. They're not these little philosopher kings. They need to be protected, and then when people need to guide them through these difficult, waters that they may be experiencing. And when they're 18, I think that's when they should be able to pursue some of these body changes if they really really want to. I don't know what's wrong with that. That seems like it's
Informed consent,
it's
basically.
allowing people to make changes. It's trying to put up proper safeguards. But I mean, the rules can't just be that there's no rules and it's just whatever. It can't just be like over the counter vaginoplasties, like where we're getting to the point of now. So yeah, I mean, just be compassionate for people, but really needs to, first and foremost, you need to care about what's true about biology. We can't be lying to kids about they can really be a boy if they're a girl, that sex is a social construct, all this stuff, because that's just confusing kids and makes it even less likely for them to be able to make an informed consent if they don't even know what they're identifying as, and we're just seeding some sort of body dissociative disorder in people. So yeah, that's I don't know if that's a great answer, but that's what I'm trying to do, and that's what I've been trying to do.
Thank you so much, Colin. I really appreciate it. And thanks for
Thank
sticking
you.
your neck out.
Yep, I'll be doing that probably for some time to come.
Good luck with that.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I hope you don't get too much hate. I can't imagine. We didn't really, everything we said, I think, was pretty kosher.
Yeah, it's kosher, we'll see. I don't even know it's kosher anymore in this world.
Yeah. Oh, well.
Thank you.